afternoon. Thank you for having me. My presentation really has sort of three kind of themes. One is around defining what we mean by environmental justice, outlining different concepts and things to pay attention to in developing policy in a way that is inclusive of people of color and low-income communities, and to identify a couple of key issues that I think are sort of, there's real synergy of kind of low-hanging fruit around collaboration between environmental justice groups and environmental conservation groups, and potentially the California Native Plant Society. And so I'll get into a little bit of those. I think the title of the talk is Bridging the Gap with Communities of Color. I think the thing that I sort of want to leave you with is there really isn't very much of a gap in terms of interest or desire for communities of color to participate in environmental decision-making or environmental conservation. I think the gap is sort of in how we work together in a way that builds community power. And so I want to give some ideas around that. And so my first slide is to tell you a little bit about Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment. So we were founded in 1989 as an environmental justice organization to bridge the gap between legal advocacy on the environment and legal advocacy on social justice. And since then, we've really broadened to not just be focused on legal advocacy, but also on community organizing and community empowerment. And so our mission is to achieve environmental justice in healthy, sustainable communities through collective action and the law. So we combine community organizing and legal advocacy. And we have three ambitions in our work. One is to build the capacity of individuals who are working within the community so that they enter a campaign with a certain set of skills and they leave the campaign with even more capacity than when they enter. The second ambition is to build the power of the community. So unite individuals and build their collective power vis-a-vis decision makers so that they can have not only a seat at the table, but also are able to define problems and solutions to those problems. And then the third ambition is to address the environmental problem facing the community. So two of our three ambitions are really focused on power. And I think power building in environmental justice is really important. So when we talk about environmental justice, there are various definitions of environmental justice. One is the US EPA and the federal government define environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people regardless of race, national origin, income, and California also has adopted a similar definition. It was one of the first states to adopt a state definition of environmental justice in 1999. And it too has a fair treatment kind of mandate. The community definition of environmental justice is often thought of as a right to a clean environment where people live, work, play, pray. In some ways, the governmental definitions tend to focus on more process-orientated, a fair process. People are able to be involved in the decision-making process, have a seat at the table, there's public disclosure of information, there's an opportunity to comment, and people are treated, the policy itself is applicable to everybody. Everybody is treated equally under the policy. In the community definition, it's much more outcome-oriented. It is having a clean environment. It is having that as the end goal of environmental justice. Not just the opportunity to participate in the process to get to that clean environment, which is very important, but it's also having that clean environment at the end of the day. And so it gets into a couple of key principles of environmental justice that I think as we're developing environmental policy, I think it's very important to keep at the forefront. One is the difference between equality and fairness, which is treating everybody the same. And our policies, and many environmental policies, they apply to everybody regardless of where they live. It's, clean air standards are applicable everywhere. But what that means in terms of a particular local area is sort of the difference between equity, and fairness. People are not starting off in the same place. And so that's what this sort of gets at. We could give everybody the same size box, but that's not going to help them achieve their goal of actually seeing the game. The other thing is it's not only about giving people a box, it's also about allowing people to build the box for themselves and having the resources and tools to do that so that they have their needs met and we have similar outcomes. And the other thing is around power. So it's about allowing and giving people the opportunity, the capacity, and the space to define what a clean environment means for them. So I think those are all very important aspects of environmental justice when it comes to policy making. And so what does environmental injustice look like? And I think what we've seen from state-developed tools like the California Environmental EnviroScreen that the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, OEHA, has put together, based on publicly available data, it sort of shows that the disparities of existing harms, so they tracked various environmental harms, like do you house a hazardous waste facility? What is your air quality? What is your water quality? Do you have, are you exposed to pesticides? Are you exposed to other industrial sources that are found on the toxic release inventory? Do you have access to open space? And they tracked that around environmental harms indicators. And then they layered on factors around socioeconomic status, English language learners, poverty rates, access to health care, and they multiplied your exposure to environmental hazards, your socioeconomic status, and they arrived at a score. And so the more red the area is, the more highly impacted they are. So the more environmental harms and the more socioeconomic vulnerabilities they're exposed to. And so you can see running through the Central Valley, several of the communities are bright red in LA, a little bit in the Bay Area, a little bit in the Imperial Valley. These are some of the communities that have been long seen as being vulnerable or disadvantaged. And so what we see on the right hand is the different ethnicities or racial groups and where they fall in terms of the percentiles. So as you can see, the worse the environment, the more likely you're going to have a high percentage of people of color living in that area. The better the environment, the fewer people of color and the more white the population is. And as you can see, compared to the state, as Vern was mentioning, the demographics of the state are shifting. And that's important to pay attention to, particularly as more and more people are being exposed to environmental harms. We can't leave those disparities off the table when we're talking about policy interventions around environmental benefits as well as environmental harms. So demographics in the environment. I think that there's sometimes, every so often, a report will come out that kind of says, hey, people of color, Latinos care about the environment. It's like it's a discovery. It's actually like there's been a whole movement of people of color for like over 25 years that has been wanting environmental protections and regulatory protections, conservation protections, a deep commitment to environmental benefits because they're being negatively impacted by environmental decision making right now. So NRDC comes out with a study. This is 87% of Latino voters think protecting natural resources is an important issue for the country to address. 2012 Sierra Club shows 91% of voters agree that protecting land and water protects my culture, family, and community. And 95% believe outdoor activities are vital as well. So there's a deep commitment there. And so I think the reality is that people of color are, and we see it every day, are engaged on environmental issues and have a commitment to those issues. It's a matter of are we including them in the process of defining the solutions, defining the policies that are going to make California a healthier and more vibrant place to live. And these demographics are also playing out in, I think, some key electoral cycles in California. People of color in 2010, I think that was really an area, an election that's been sort of talked about a lot in terms of the effect that the people of color and voters of color actually had in outcomes. When you looked at the race for governor, Jerry Brown was elected in 2010 because people of color voted for him. The white vote would not have carried Jerry Brown. In fact, and similarly with Prop 23, which was the attempt to roll back on AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, to sort of delay implementation. And that was seen as a very big environmental sort of fight. It was between, do we allow the polluters to dictate to us when we can and cannot regulate around greenhouse gas emissions? And there again, voters of color were instrumental in defeating Prop 23 and preventing those delays. And I think that there again, the white vote significantly supported passing Prop 23. So I think there's a real need to recognize that there's a very practical need. If we want to pass good environmental policy, we need people of color to be involved in the creating of that policy and advocating for that policy and feel that that policy benefits them. Particularly as we're seeing a number of legislators of color who are looking to see how do my constituencies feel about these issues, and are they being included? So I think that's very important to make sure that we keep that in mind as we're developing environmental policy. I often feel like environmental justice policy is not sort of a subset of environmental policy. I think environmental policy is going to have to become more responsive to people of color as we move forward in the state. And then opportunities for collaboration. I think there's some very short-term areas of synergy between the conservation community and the environmental justice community. The California Environmental Quality Act is constantly being talked about being reformed. And I think those reforms are, everyone always says, we want to keep it, we don't want to touch the things that protect people, but we also want to make it okay and streamline the process piece. Well, there's a real overlap, I think, particularly the way environmental justice advocates view CEQA between the policy of participation and the substantive components of CEQA. And I think one of the areas that's constantly under attack in terms of CEQA is, do we really need to talk about aesthetics? Do we really need to talk about biology? Are those really important CEQA issues that should be allowed to hold up a project? Those are often things, talking points that come up. And I often point to the case of the Delano prison expansion in the mid-2000s. I forget the exact dates, but Critical Resistance sued the state that wanted to build the second prison in Delano on CEQA grounds that they failed to comply with the environmental quality, with an environmental impact report requirements. It failed to do several different types of analyses. This was important for the community of Delano, which is a predominantly farm worker community. They already had one prison and had been promised a whole host of economic development based on that one prison that didn't actually occur. So when they came back and said, we want to do a second prison, people were like, what are you talking about? You promised us all these things that didn't happen. Also, the state had decided the city needed a wastewater treatment expansion for the capacity. And the state had a choice to either build its own wastewater treatment plant or to help the city with the cost of expanding its plant. And the state decided to go on its own. And so the city was really upset that here was this opportunity, the state had been promising all these benefits. They weren't even benefiting in a very practical way of help us upgrade our wastewater treatment system. So this challenge was launched under the California Environmental Quality Act, several different areas of the need for more analysis. And the one area that actually won was the fact that they hadn't done a biological study on the Tipton kangaroo rat. And it was really important. It was something that the community, I mean, that was not their number one issue. Their number one issue was, can we make sure that the state is doing what it's supposed to be doing to mitigate its impacts? And the advocates wanted some time to make sure that they had advocacy opportunities at the state level to talk about budget, to talk about construction, to talk about operation, to talk about need. And so this was a very important claim that was associated in this lawsuit. And it demonstrated that this relationship between conservation and environmental justice is very connected. And to try and distinguish is really, I think, a mistake. The other areas around pesticides and fumigant use. I mean, the use of pesticides harms plants and people. And the Department of the Department of Health has issued a report that documents Latino school children in California are disproportionately impacted and exposed to pesticides in school. And so that's a real opportunity for us to begin to advocate for what are we doing in terms of pesticide use. How do we reduce use, and how do we create alternatives that are less toxic, that are less damaging, and that provide for health for our school children as well as for the native plant communities that surround these areas. And then the third kind of area that I think there's opportunity for synergy is around allocations of cap and trade funding. This has been a big area around the state, and the environmental justice community has had mixed feelings about cap and trade as a whole. But there is some real need to participate around design issues, I think, because otherwise communities of color are just going to be left out again. So there's been a set aside under SB 535 that allocates at least 25% of cap and trade funding for disadvantaged communities. One of our concerns, one of my personal concerns, is that in many circles, that allocation is seen as how we're going to provide equity in communities of color. But that doesn't advance the kind of equity principles. We're not all starting from the same place. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And the 25% is not a ceiling, it's a floor. And it's not just about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it's also about how are we going to build equity? How do we advance job training? How do we make sure that the communities where these projects and investments are going to be made are actually benefiting in a real long-term and sustainable way? And I think those kind of considerations of how do we build an equity into environmental policy making, whether it be through investment, whether it be through permitting, whether it be through mitigation, whether it be through the CEQA process, I think that's really the key and the challenge, I think, for all of us who advocate for the environment in California. Thank you.